when you raise your hand to ask a question, a couple of us will be watching for you, and we're going to give you the mic so that you can ask your question with the mic, and that will help everyone in the room hear your question. So if you raise your hand, we'll get to you, but we're going to get the mic to you for that. So I just wanted to let you know that. And we're going to start in just a moment when we get the okay.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing, testing.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Soprema Senior Center and the program that we have today with the book Remembering Wadsworth by the wonderful author Caesar Carrino. When we planned to have this author talk, I talked to Caesar back in February. He was so excited, and once we found out that he had passed away, all of us were so saddened. He means so much to the entire town of Wadsworth. And so when we went to the calling hours, I told his family that we were not going to cancel this program. Not only would we be talking about his book, Remembering Wadsworth, we would also be remembering Caesar today. And so I reached out to Roger Havens, who is an amazing Wadsworth historian as well with the history of Wadsworth. He has been with the city schools for over 43 years. He's a wealth of knowledge, but he was also an amazing friend to Caesar Carrino. And so I couldn't think of a better person to invite to lead us in the book Remembering Wadsworth and the discussions that we're going to be having today. So I would like to give a warm welcome to Roger Havens. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so this is very interesting because they asked me to do a book talk on another author's book. I've never done a book talk, period, let alone somebody else's book. So here I am trying to ad-lib this whole thing, and now I have Caesar staring down at me from this angle and this angle, so I can't get away with anything here today. So yeah, as you know, Caesar passed away, and he was supposed to do a program for the Historical Society, and he passed before that. I had asked him to do the history of the Historical Society and the museum. And I knew I was going to have to put slides together because he was not tech savvy when it came to doing PowerPoints and things like that. He could type out documents and send them, and we could communicate that way, but when it came into doing some actual things that were above that standard, then he struggled. So anyway, so I put that PowerPoint together and did it along the way, and yeah, I hate to say, but it didn't surprise me that he didn't make it that far. So ironically, about a week before he passed, I spent the entire day with him, kind of accidentally. He was typing out an article for our newsletter, which he did every month. And he got a hold of me and he said, well, Roger, I typed in this article, and for whatever reason, my computer has gone a little haywire, and I can't get the, So he went on about that, and I said, well, let me come down. Maybe I can check out your computer, your laptop, and see what the problem is, and maybe it's an easy fix. So I went down there, and here the screen was broken. What I suspect is that he was sitting there in his chair and maybe fallen asleep, and it dropped off his lap and it shattered. So it had just this whole scramble on the screen. And I thought, well, this is beyond what I can do. But I ended up taking his laptop downtown to get it fixed. But in the meantime, he wanted so much to get this article to me, but it was entrapped in that laptop. And I asked him, I said, so how did you type this article out? Did you just put it in email form, which when I got articles from him, he either put it in email form or he put it in a Word document. And he said, well, I put it in email form. I go, oh, perfect. I said, we can, if you give me your password and your email address, I can pull it off my computer because it's up there in the cloud. And so I just kind of started a whole day adventure because he finally did that. But then, of course, for me to tap into it from my computer, it's asking for confirmation, which is sent to his telephone. And I'm at home trying to explain, and I'm thinking, I don't think he understands what these codes are, and, it's simple, but it's complicated for somebody that doesn't do it all the time. So I drove down there, and between my laptop, his laptop, finally got into his email, and it's not there. And it would have been automatically saved regardless, but it wasn't there. And I said, "Are you sure you sent it to me by email, or did you do a Word document?" And he said, "Yeah, I put it in Word document." I said, "Well, that's a problem, because now it's inside your computer and it's no place else except there." So, and he was so frustrated with it. I said, "You know what? Let's not panic yet. Let me see if they can do a quick fix downtown," which they could not. They said it was going to take a week to get it back. And I said, "Well, what did you write your article on?" He said there we go. The sanitation history of Wadsworth. And he says, "You don't think that would offend anyone, do you?" "No, Caesar, nothing offends anybody anymore." Because he was always apologetic, saying things like that, "Well, I mentioned such and such in there. Do you think people are going to be offended?" I go, "No, they're not going to be offended. Don't worry about it." But that's the type of person he was. Very sensitive about other people's feelings and desires. So I said, "Well, it's apparent we're not going to have this article for this month. I'll just use it for the next month." And I said, "Do you have any articles on standby?" He said, "No, but I can type one out." And he did. And he just impromptu typed out an article. And I said, "Don't make it very long." The other one on the sanitation, it was like 3 pages long. "Just make a short one." I said, "It's the end of the year. I'm going to put calendar of events on, so it's going to fill up just kind of naturally." So he sat there, and I actually allowed him to use my computer, hoping he wouldn't drop it and shatter it like the other one, because in that one I have 40,000 pictures in there of historical significance of Wadsworth. So I told him, I said, "Yeah, don't do anything," because I had to leave it with him, because eventually I had to go home for a while. And so anyway, he did that article, and that was for April. In May, I thought, maybe it's not in the best taste in the world, even though it was his last article, not to be an article about the sanitation history of Wadsworth. So I'll put it in September's and put pictures that I have, but not of the actual sanitation stuff. Anyway, so again, that's who he was. And I went down and after his passing, because I knew I had to do this book, and I went and stopped and talked to Linda for a little bit. Because on here he thanks Linda, I think, at the beginning, in the foreword, and anyway, kind of related about how his family helped him out with this. Oh yeah, the acknowledgments. The author wishes to acknowledge his wife Linda for her support in promoting the history of Wadsworth, for her role in contributing research for this book, and her active participation in the Wadsworth Area Historical Society. Her career as a historian served as the author's inspiration to become involved in recording local history. Appreciation is offered out to their son Michael for his computer technology assistant, without which this book would have been written in Spencerian cursive. His wording. So the running writing, that's what they call it over in Great Britain, the running writing, cursive. Finally, credit is given to the Wadsworth Area Historical Society for supplying the pictures used for the various chronicles. So I sat down with Linda and I said, "Okay, I have to give this book talk. Tell me some of the things about the research of this book, or some challenges that you met. Give me something." And she said, "Well, I didn't write it." I said, "I know, but obviously you helped Caesar out, what are some of the fun stories that you can tell or share? I didn't do anything. So I'm pulling and nothing's coming out. So, and if you know Linda, she's just a very private, quiet person. And I was happy to get that much out of her, but I did interview her for this, and there wasn't a whole lot she could offer, except knowing that we were going to be doing this particular thing in his absence. So then at the end, I found it somewhere in here, about the author. So again, this is about Caesar. He was born in Wadsworth on January 5th, 1931. Dr. Caesar Carrino, pictured here with his wife Linda. They attended a Wadsworth schools, or he did. And he graduated in 1948. He earned a bachelor's degree before serving in the military, and master's and doctorate degrees later. Beginning in 1954, he taught in the Norton schools, became principal in 1956, functioned as a supervisor in the Summit County schools in 1966, and joined the University of Akron in 1967. In 1970, he became the assistant to the dean of the College of Education. Assistant dean in 1972, was then promoted to dean of evening college and summer sessions in 1974. He retired in 1989. Following retirement, he trained industrialists, served as a principal of 2 schools, became a high school chancellor, advised at-risk students, directed a professional education unit, and became mayor of Wadsworth in the year 2000. Well, it says presently, but anyway, he was working with the historic downtown Wadsworth to help preserve its historic integrity and audits, and he audits the American University programs for accreditation. So, again, yeah, his credits would go on and on and on, since he had to write this about himself, or maybe that's the part Linda wrote, I don't know. I'll give her the credit for it, because that's so hard to write about yourself. And so he ended up writing several books, this being one of them, and evidently when he was contacted and asked, which book do you want to talk about, he wanted to talk about this one. He also has the folks of Wadsworth, Ohio. This one's more concentrated with people or groups of people in Wadsworth, whereas the Remembering Wadsworth talks about both people and things being like the Ohio Injector and the history behind it, and the box board, and et cetera, et cetera. I did ask Linda, I said, the one thing, because I archive all the historic pictures of Wadsworth, and I said, I can tell you, in all my archives, I cannot find this picture that's pictured at the bottom. What is it, and who is it? And I did get a little rise out of her on that one. She says, I don't know, Caesar and I talked about that picture. Nobody knows what it is, but she said, in our opinion, it looked like it was people who worked in an asylum. And if you look at it, it does look a little creepy. And I can't tell if they're all women or mostly women and 1 or 2 guys. I mean, if you look at it, and if it is a guy or a woman in the center, God bless them, because I'm not sure what's going on there. It's almost like it was a plant that they were going to put this unusual person in there for some obscure reason. So that's probably the biggest discussion of the book, is the front cover. Now, the upper picture is one of the old mills that used to be down in the south end of Wadsworth. So the south end is kind of where industry developed as early as in the 1840s, and that's when they set up the mills on the creek that goes through there. That's Blocker's Run that goes there and runs underneath Main Street and dumps out there where Plastics Are Unique comes out. And a long time ago, that area was where the Wadsworth Salt Company was. So there was a pond right there. I don't know if anybody can remember that far back. if you can, then God bless you, because that salt factory, the Wadsworth Salt Factory, burnt down in 1938. So what's that? That's about the time that Caesar was born. So you'd have to be in your upper 90s to even remember that. So anyway, so that's where the mills started out, and there were several of them on that creek that went through there. There was one or two of them on Holmesbrook Creek, and again, none of those do I remember as a kid, but some of the grindstones, if it was a grist mill type thing, I think one grindstone ended up in the backyard of Tommy Lucas on Lucas Court, and I think it's still there, but nobody wanted it, so he went and took it. And there's a picture of, gosh, it was Ruby Razor's dad standing on top of one of those. So that goes way back too, Mr. McElroy. So again, I don't know about this book and what to discuss in it. I mean, you really have to read it to get the full impact of it. I did this thing a year ago down at the library where I went through the Red Book, the Wadsworth Heritage Book, that was written in 1964 and then re-released in 2000. And we went through page by page. I skipped a lot of pages because some of it was just kind of busy work, reading names, but just kind of going through the history of Wadsworth. Who attended some of those classes? I think I saw quite a... Joe, you did. Raise your hand. You know, act like you're with us here. So yeah, I recognize some people that went through there. And a few of the people who did it, now they help give tours of the museum, especially when third graders go through every May. And so we just recently had well over 300 children going through the museum and getting just a quick view of where things are. And exciting news is that we have kids who were upset, and they're now like going into 7th grade, 8th grade. They missed the museum tour because of COVID when they were in 3rd grade, and they're coming back to us and asking whether we would do a tour for them. So we are going to do a special tour for those that missed out. So we'll see how many show up, but from that I think we're going to develop maybe a kids club, a history club, and kind of utilize those kids. If they're that motivated to come back to a house and look at old stuff, maybe they're motivated to help us out do some fun things. So we're hoping that that spurs some things on. And so, again, I went through this book, and I did find errors in the book. And I'm not saying that Caesar made these errors, but that's what happens when you have books printed. And I worked in a print shop for 10 years, and I know because I was doing a lot of the proofreading and that type of thing, and once you put ink on the paper, you can't take it off. So in some of these cases, I mean, if you have an actual book, and it starts out almost on page 1, it shows one of the first pioneers to Wadsworth, and they have his name down as John Dean. So I don't know, that's a crossover from Watergate. Wasn't that John Dean? That's the only John Dean I could think of. So this was Benjamin Dean, and this was the son of Daniel Dean. Daniel Dean and his wife, and Oliver Durham and his wife and their children were the first pioneers in Wadsworth, and they settled just down the street from here, where the flashing stop sign is what we call Western Star, or they're on Broad Street. So they settled there and started the whole thing. This was one of the boy who kind of came out with actually Mr. Durham, and they knocked down the first trees. They stayed here the first night. So obviously that was 1814. So we don't get photography until 1850s, 1860s. So this is a charcoal sketch of the sun. So we don't, have pictures of the actual pioneers themselves because, unless somebody sketched a picture of them, and more than likely that ended up in a family that may have totally disappeared from around here. So again, he showed up to the first anniversary of Wadsworth's history and that was 1874. And so we celebrate a 60th anniversary. They didn't celebrate a 50th anniversary. Well, do the math. 1814, 50 years after that, what was going on? The Civil War. So they didn't really want to have a party during the Civil War, so they waited another 10 years. And they really called it the Pioneer Reunion of Medina County. And since we were kind of the first, we were actually the second community in Medina, it drew mostly Wadsworth people, obviously. And so some of them came back, like, because many of them had moved on. They didn't just settle Wadsworth. Some of them settled here, developed a farm, cut down the trees, got some tillable land, build a house, and then they moved farther west to do the same thing in other property. And that's kind of what some of them did, I guess, for a living, just setting up farms and moving on. So after 60 years, and so with the Dean family, is Ramona here today? Ramona Wanoff? She lives here on Broad Street. Anyway, she's the relative that's still living today that was connected to them. And a good story about that, I don't know if you read it, but you know, I've been volunteering with the Friends of Woodlawn Cemetery, and I could find Oliver Durham's tombstone, but I couldn't find Daniel Dean and his family. And it shows on the map that he's there, but he's not there. His tombstone's not there, let's put it that way. And that one was a little bit upsetting. Number one, he was the first pioneer. Number two, he was a veteran of the War of 1812. And I'm thinking, so here this guy's buried here, no marker, and not even a marker to show that he was a veteran. And so I talked to the Historical Society, and they agreed that we would make a tombstone for him and put a marker where I think he was buried. And I'm pretty sure we got it. Oh, within 100 yards. No, I'm hoping within about 10 feet. But anyway, so I went up to the monument company up to the north end to their office and talked about it, and they gave me a quote of $1,000. And so the Historical Society said, yeah, we'll donate money to do that. Next day they called me from the monument company and said, oh my gosh, we just started thinking about what you said. We're going to donate it. So Ramona now has a place that she can go and put her flowers at Memorial Day, you know, after. But she said even when she was a kid, there was no tombstone there. But yet in the records it shows. But the old grounds of the Woodlawn Cemeteries, missing lots of tombstones. They must have broken over the years and they just got pitched, is all we can figure out, because we have some old pictures. It shows that old part chock full of stones, and I would say a good 20% of them are missing. And in fact, there was one that was missing, and I see Claire Jo's out here because it was a relative of her, Abraham Hard, and we only had part of his tombstone, just the bottom part of it, and his wife was next to it, Rebecca Hard. They're the ones that had the Hard log cabin, which is now down at the park there at the county park. Oh, shoot. Greenleaf Park, I'm sorry. Yeah, Greenleaf Park. So that's the original Hard cabin, and it used to be close to the corner of Bonita Road and Reimer Road. And these people built a new house. They had this like in the backyard. They put up with it for so long. They finally put it out on waivers. Whoever wants it can have it. And I think it was the Medina County Historical Society or the parks snatched it up and took it to Greenleaf Park to preserve it, which was good news. But anyway, so he was missing half of his tombstone. The one day I was down at the office there at Woodlawn Cemetery, and was in the back where they have kind of a boneyard, not real bones, but pieces and parts of tombstones that they remove because some people change them out. And here's the top part of Abraham just sitting there, minding its own business. Who knows how long it was there, but we were able to bring it back and epoxy it back on, clean it up, and he looks like he always was, I think. So anyway, so as I go through these books and I see these names, you know, my brain is pinging the whole time saying, oh yeah, I know this, I know that now, and how they're connected, especially in the cemetery. I always tell them the cemetery walk is like a walk through time. But that's not what this is all about. Again, it's going back to the main thing, and that is Caesar and his dedication in writing these books and stories, and thank goodness he did it for prosperity. And it's in print, and nobody's going to take it away. But that's the one thing I found with him, you know, that, and now I have nobody because I get inquiries all the time because I am president of the Historical Society, and the website directs them to me and my email address. And I'd have him to call up because I had no idea what they were talking about, and I would give it to him, and then he would tell me what they were talking about, and he would be right for the most part, or he'd at least point me in the right direction. And speaking of that, and just reading about it in the book, and again, where I'm making connections, I got contacted, it's been about a month ago, from a railroad museum out in Arizona. Who would think that somebody would be contacting me in Wadsworth? The reason they contacted me is because they have steam engines. And while they were working on the steam engine, they noticed that the injectors on it were made in Wadsworth, Ohio. And so he called me, like I know about injectors, you know. But he contacted me and he said, do you have any information, because we know we're going to have to replace some of these parts of the steam engine, and would you happen to have it? Are you kidding me? And I said, well, I'll check into it as much as I can. And he specifically called it a Chicago injector, which I didn't quite understand, but they produced 3 different types of injectors. One was a Chicago, one was a Garfield, and one I think they just called it the Wadsworth. They were names of specific injectors. So I learned something there, that they had one called Chicago. Why they had one called Chicago, I don't know, until I read the book. Then I noticed that a guy named Charles Edinger became part of the Ohio Injector Company here in Wadsworth. He grew up here, moved to Chicago, but then he was in thick with the railroads and trains, and he made connections of selling the injector to all these train companies. And since he lived in Chicago, guess what? They called it a Chicago injector because they had a plant in Chicago making them too. So again, I'm still kind of confused. Well, I mean, I learned that much. So we have a display case down there in the museum that is dedicated to the Ohio Injector Company. And I opened it up because I knew there were a couple of books in there. And I pulled out a book, it's about this size, hardback book. And I started flipping through it. I'll be doggone if they didn't have diagrams of all these injectors that the injector produced. And this was like 1939. So I scanned what they called the Chicago injector. It covered like 6 pages. I scanned it, sent it to them. They said, perfect, that's what we were looking for. What's the odds of that thing happening? So, yeah, we get unusual requests. Now, had Caesar been here and I had asked him, he would have probably named off the part and all the different pieces and parts to it, but he wasn't there. So he's forced me to learn how to fish on my own. But I want to, well, are there questions about anything in the book? I just reread the whole book, and I highlighted 10,000 things in here, and I know there's no way we're going to go over these things. You know, if everybody had a book, that's one thing, but if you don't, then it's going to be kind of a boring day in the neighborhood. But he does cover the gamut of starting out with the pioneers. He talks about the different companies in Wadsworth. He talks about the mills, the pioneer mills. Talks about the coal mines and how that started up in Wadsworth. Anyway.
What's an injector?
What?
I've heard of a Ohio injector for years, but I just don't know what an injector is.
And I find that hilarious because my dad worked at the Ohio Injector. And of course, at school, you had to write down where your parents worked. And I put Ohio Injector. Then the next question is, what do they do? I didn't know what an injector was. How do I know what he does? And then when you ask him, you know, he worked in the foundry part, so he was making the core. He just said he was a core maker. So they make these cores, then they pour the injector. But the injector, the Wadsworth Injector started out making injectors for steam engines. So it's the one that they inject the water, which produces the steam, which blah, blah, blah. But of course, that went out of vogue in the early 1900s when they were getting away from steam engines. So the injector started focusing on making valves because all the injectors had valves, and there's many valves, turn off and on, just like out in your garage or outside on your house. That's why I tell the little kids, because they'll want to know what they made. And then I hold one up and I said, you know, it's just like a faucet, you turn it on and off. So think about that. Back in the early 1900s, all these houses were being produced, and all these valves that go into a single house, let alone the buildings, let alone the wars, and that's why they allowed them to stay open during World War II, because of all the valves that go into the submarines and the battleships. And then after the wars, things started going south a little bit, although you had the housing boom that helped out. But then the oil wells, especially the one up in Alaska, saved them. And they made valves as tiny as a couple inches tall to 10 foot tall, especially for the oil wells. And again, those were the ones with the big wheels on them to turn on and off. So Caesar, you know, told me that he worked at the injector at one time. And I'm not sure what he did, but then again, I'm not sure what anybody did at the injector. That's just what I was told. All right, other questions or?
You mentioned Wadsworth was the second.
Hang on.
All right, Wadsworth was the second.
Second settlement, or?
Oh, yeah.
Who's the first?
It would be Harrisville.
Where's Harrisville?
Lodi. Yeah, they renamed it. So yeah, for whatever reason, when the first pioneers came through, the first ones went right directly through Wadsworth and just kept going west, and they ended up and established Harrisville, which would have been a heck of a journey because of the River Styx swamp. You know, now it's drained and now we have roads that go across it, not an issue. Back in the pioneer days, it was a major issue because it was a swamp. So when they were cutting down, trying to get their wagons through, they were also throwing down the tops of trees so they wouldn't sink in. And I bet there was a lot of language thrown around because that had to be frustrating, sinking down in that muck. And but like I say, today it's drained. We don't think too much about it. But so those little creeks have kind of taken all of it. But before then, it would have just been walking through a muck pile and then dealing with trees that you had to cut down. Good question. And yeah, dealing with rattlesnakes, you're dealing with wolves, you're dealing with black bear, you're dealing with everything that Mother Nature can throw at you. And so So then another town popped up between here and Lodi, or Harrisville, and it was called Leroy. And so what is it called today? It's Westfield Center. You know, they're always finding out that, oh, there's always another town by that name, and so then they change them off, and Rittman went through like 3 different names before they settled on Rittman. But, yeah, so we have a poster down in the museum that says the Farmers Insurance, and it says Leroy, Ohio. And people say, well, where that's at? They can't find it, they can't Google it. Doesn't exist. Okay, other great questions. Or give me some comments about what you remember of Caesar, because I'm trying to think of some of the things. He's just an interesting person, and people love to come in and talk to him during First Fridays when he sat down. I had to have a sign to put on his chair that says, Dr. Carrino, historian, so people knew that was him, but everybody knew him. Yes, sir.
Wasn't this part of the Western Reserve that was given to Revolutionary War? People that fought, they never were paid. They were given land for when they fought, and that's why it was called Western Reserve, and it was handed out as payment.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that history gets a little bit fuzzy, but obviously the first colonies, the 13 colonies, settled on the East Coast. And at the time that they settled it and was getting charter for the land from the king, they didn't realize that the land went all the way from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. They just thought it was just a chunk of land, and they split it off. And basically they said their western boundaries was wherever the land goes, not knowing that it went thousands of miles. So when the colonies started turning into states and things, and they realized that their property was long and thin that went all the way to the coast, they gave up the land and gave it to the government. Said, we don't want this much land. We want to keep our state, manageable. So everybody gave it up except for Connecticut, and they hung on to theirs. And it didn't go all the way, but it went all the way through Ohio, or partway through Ohio. And so they called it the Western Reserve because they reserved it for their people. They felt their people deserved the land because of the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. Their houses were burnt down by the British. Their land was destroyed by the British. So they reserved that land for their people to go and settle. Now, there was different groups. They didn't get it for nothing. So there were investors that invested in this land, one of them being Elijah Wadsworth. And his chunk of land he invested in is basically what Wadsworth Township is today. But he paid for it, even though the government owed him a lot of money. They didn't make amends to him as far as what they owed him, because again, he was a soldier, he was a general, and he never got paid until after his death. And then finally they paid him for, his his work in the military. But he invested money. The Wadsworths sound like they were a very rich family. Most of them lived out in New York. And so he was an offspring of that. And before that, of course, they came from Britain. But anyway, so he sold off his property. He set up, he built a house in Canfield, Ohio, which if you've ever been to Canfield, and if you haven't, just jump on Broad Street and head east, and 60 miles later, you're going to end up in Canfield. So it's on the Greenwich Road, basically. So his house was there, and as the pioneering people from the East Coast, or the colonists, I guess you would say, they would stop by his house and buy a parcel of land. And how they marked it, I don't know. How they knew that when they got out here, what parcel of land was there, I don't know. And obviously those parcels of lands were marked out in 100, 120 acre parcels. But ironically, he never set foot in Wadsworth. He just sold off the land. And it wasn't up to him on naming it, it was up to the people when they were trying to establish what the name of their area was going to be, because we were originally part of Wolf Creek Township. And as you know, they're in Loyal Oak, they call that the Wolf Creek Tavern, because we were part of that township. We were all one big happy family. Norton, Western Star, Wadsworth, there was no delineation. So that's why it's hard sometimes, where do you stop? That's why we call it the Wadsworth Area Historical Society, because over the years, that area changed out when they started splitting us out into counties, and they split us away from, not away, but right on the line of Western Star. So Caesar grew up on Silver Crest when he was a kid, close to Silver Creek. Now, of course, I assume he bought that parcel of land and built that house there on Silver Creek. 555. Thank goodness it wasn't 666. But that's his address. It's right out there by the road, 555. And his brother, I think, is what I surmised, the one that ran the auto, Henry Carrino. He must have gotten part of the old homestead property, because his wife still lives there, and it's kind of back behind the original house. But I think she has, like 10, 12 acres, part of that property. The one thing here in these last couple of years that I was able to do for Caesar, and that I think he just thoroughly loved, the first thing was I got him on one of those maintenance trucks that jumps up onto the railroad track. You've ever seen that white truck going down there and you think, what, a truck coming down the railroad tracks? But, that's their maintenance truck. So I had the guy's children at Franklin School, and that's where I made a connection there. And I said, could you do something? I'm sure it would make this guy's day. If we can get him up in your truck, because of course it's one of those that's jacked way up, and that was the biggest challenge, is getting Caesar in there. But boy, he was going to get up in there one way or the other, on his account or my account. But we got him on there, drove down to Rittman, got on the tracks there at Rittman, followed it through Wadsworth, went into Barberton, and in fact we got off the track in Barberton and got onto another set of tracks that I didn't even know existed. Well, I knew that there's a lot of train tracks in Barberton, but there was a huge bridge that we went across that you have no access from the road. Nobody's allowed to walk back there, because I think it's hooked up to the companies there. And they said, don't ever try to walk it or somebody's going to shoot you. But because he worked for the rail, he got the access back there. But anyway, yeah, I looked down and you can see the creek way down below, and I'm thinking, boy, this is a nice scenic railroad thing. But of course, along the way, he was mentioning everything along the way, and especially going through Sherman, and that's where he was principal there at Sherman School. And yeah, I couldn't hear, I was sitting in the back seat, but I kept trying to listen to the stories. And the guy that runs the railroad for Wadsworth, he was so appreciative of that. So then I talked to the mayor about one other thing to do, because because I'm part of the Friends of Wadsworth Trails, some of us got to go back onto the old brickyard property. And I said, you know what, I bet, because now the city has side-by-sides or big four-wheelers, I said, I bet he would love to go back there and look at the old brickyard for what's there. There's not a whole lot there. And sure enough, Mayor Lawbaugh and some of her guys loaded him up in that and took him back behind St. Ed's. And I said, don't take him everywhere, because some of that is really nasty back in there. But they took it enough that he was so happy about that. Then the last thing, which I couldn't do because it's turned into winter, and he's a hard guy. He didn't talk a lot about himself or any kind of needs or wants. And then he told me one time, he said, well, I'd really like to travel that trolley line trail. And I called Robin and I said, what's the odds of me, because I do have a side-by-side, of me being able to drive that and not get arrested by the police for being on there? She said, well, we could make arrangements that I could tell them that you're going to be on there. But it got so cold then. It was in October. And I thought, well, that's something I would do this summer, is to take him on that trail, which never happened. But he was a member of the Friends of the Trails, but he never was able to set foot onto the trail. So I was kind of sad for. He can see it from up above. He has a bird's eye view of it now. So that's the good news. Other questions or comments? Yes.
I met Caesar at, it was Central High School at the time, Isham, in first grade, and Betty and I graduated with Caesar. We were classmates. We were the country kids.
You were the country kids that went out with Caesar.
We were the bus kids.
And we won't ask you about details of your dates, but I'm sure they were exciting. No, that's great. Anybody else close to Caesar's?
I've got a story to tell about Caesar. When he was mayor back in 2000, 2001, Kiwanis sponsored a circus where Giant Eagle is now. And I was in charge in the circus, and they wanted us to get some celebrity from town to be in the grand entry and ride the elephant in the parade. So I went to Caesar, I said, would you do this for us? He said, sure, I'd be glad to. So we went out to the circus ground, and we were walking around, and he said, he saw they had a menagerie there with some donkeys. And he said, you know, he being a Democrat, he said, I'd rather ride a donkey than the elephant. So we talked to the guy that was there, and Caesar tells his story so well.
Yes, he had
You
a.
heard that story?
Well, and I just saw a picture yesterday. Where did I see that?
I sent it to you.
Oh, that's.
And the guy, the circus guy said, yeah, you could ride the donkey if you wanted, but I wouldn't. So Caesar, with me and a couple of my grandkids, we rode the elephant in the circus grand parade. That's my favorite memory of Caesar.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how he did during the toilet toss competitions. Does anybody remember the toilet toss competitions by the Democrats?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they literally were pitching their stuff. But I do have a story about that. I took a couple of groups of kids at one time to a camp over in Scotland. And so when I'd go over there, along with some adults that were from the university, we would be working in these camps. And so we're sitting there in the evening in the lounge talking to these teachers from Scotland and, you know, trying to make conversation and trying to figure out what everybody's needs were. And the one guy came up to me. He goes, Roger, what kind of town do you live in over in the States? I said, well, I live in the state of Ohio, which is west of New York. You always have to use New York as a reference. Just west of there. And I just live in a small town close to Akron, Ohio. I said, that's where the tire companies, you know, I'm trying to make a connection. Oh, what's the name of your wee town? And I said, well, it's called Wadsworth, Ohio. I'll be damned, he said. And I go, you've heard of Wadsworth, Ohio? I saw on the telly last night, he said they was pitching toilets. So we made international news at that point. So the last day we were at the camp, he came out with his T-shirt, and instead of saying about pitching the caber, which is one of the Highland games, he crossed out caber and put toilets. So I remember sharing that with Caesar. He got a kick out of that one. Wait a minute. Don't breathe, Kathy, till you get the microphone.
I have a story. To break it up just a little bit, I moved here from Cogga Falls
Came here to Wadsworth in 7th grade, met Roger, he was my classmate. And then I graduated from Wadsworth, and then I moved away for 25 years, moved back here in 2000, which, come to know, I live right on the corner of Silver Creek and Silvercrest. And a man comes walking across the street, and here he introduced himself as the mayor of Wadsworth, which I was very honored. Here it was Carrino. You know, and there's one house up and across the street. I never got to speak to him that often, but that day I had a history of my corner. And he told me how he had the house behind me, as he grew up in a little house just behind me. And his mom and dad raised all of them, and then they built the house in front, which is still there, and that was for his brother, I think, and his family. Then eventually him and Linda moved in there, which is why it was kind of like a twinplex for a while. And then when he was expecting his first children, they moved and built the house across the street, one house up. And so I said, well, what about my house? And mine is a post and beam house. It doesn't look like it from the outside, but that's what it is. And he tried to tell me, well, I don't know much about that house. And so I don't have much, and I'm going to see Roger on that because it still bothers me. We've remodeled each room, and there's things we found and that. But Carrino did tell me that the house was built in about 1892 or 1894. But it's titled as 1926. So we've never found out why. But Carrino always had information about everybody. And he wasn't one to talk about himself, like he said. But I seen him mow his lawn every day, well, not every day, but every week. And I always wanted to spend more time with him, and I never had that chance. I would help him and Linda, maybe get the mail or whatever, but I never had that extra chance. Carrino started the alumni reunion a few years back, and of course the First Fridays, and every time I went to First Friday at the museum, he always remembered me. And even though he only seen us a couple times, I thought, he ain't gonna remember. He did. He had one heck of a memory.
Yep.
So at the reunion, I had bought one of his books, which happens to be one we're talking about today, years ago. And at that reunion, I had him autograph it for me. And it meant a lot to me, and I'm going to read it. To Kathy, a good friend and a great WHS grad, Caesar Carrino, 8/2/2019, which is the day of the reunion we had here. And I bought him his other books and books that he's helped with Mike Bird and Roger. And he was a man of information, and you just don't find that kind of people anymore. And I worry about what we're going to have after we're all gone and Roger's there.
When I'm dead.
Somebody will take it.
Just call a spade a spade.
Hopefully some young person would like to be a historian. And when Roger mentioned the kids starting to come, I think that's a good way of getting that started. Maybe somebody's going to be one of those historians, just like Roger was. And he took over. You were young when you took this over. So.
Well, 10 years ago. Yeah, I was in my teens.
But anyhow, that's my story about Carrino. I miss him, and I'm sorry for our loss.
Yeah. You can go over to Arlene there.
I have two
Oh,
comments on the pictures on the front of the little book.
Don't tell me you're on it.
Actually, I can't really be because I don't have access to all those kinds of photos. But I can tell you that the one on the lower part looks a lot like a picture that I would see in my grandmother's house. My grandmother lived in Wadsworth from 1900 until she died in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
From the 1930s until the 1950s, maybe even 60s, she rented out rooms. One of the people that she rented a room to was considered, in her opinion anyway, an extremely magnificent teacher named Miss Lytle.
My sixth grade teacher.
Val Lytle, and then she also was a principal for a while, wasn't she?
Principal.
So, but the photograph reminds me of faculty photographs I saw of Miss Lytle's people. So that might be a place. The other thing to remember is that, at least my father told me this, that college was named after a college of medicine at one time. It was a very brief history in Wadsworth. It had a big building, and then it moved to Kent and became part of Kent State. So, but that's why we have college in Broad, right? It was a medical school, supposedly.
Well, it was a Mennonite school,
It was.
but there was a medical school where the library parking lot is on the corner of.
That close to town?
Well, it was a house there on the, right across from the old post office. And that became a gas station after they tore the house down. But that was built to be like a medical school. There was another one that was there where the old Citizens Bank used to sit. It was called the Old Stone Building. And so it had a room in it for one of the parties to practice out of.
It didn't last very long here.
Right.
I know that.
Yeah.
And then it went to Kent.
Okay.
The other thing that I have a question about is my father talked about taking the trolley from Wadsworth to Barberton, from Barberton to downtown Cleveland. He went to Case Institute
Sure.
on the trolley in the 20s. And I don't know enough about that to know where it actually came through.
Well, at one point, the trolley went over to Kenmore, and Kenmore had the train station there where the, I don't know if you remember as a kid, the old Miracle Mart that was off the Kenmore Lake. Well, that was a big train station type thing where trains would come in and out. So I suspect they went as far as there and jumped on a train and then just got shuttled by the trolley after that. So Arlene had a story about Caesar.
Well, Caesar had quite a sense of humor, besides being knowledgeable. And one night, my phone rang, it was Caesar. Will you be president of the Historical Society? And I said, Caesar, I can't. I've got 6 kids. I'm president of the Garden Club. I'm just too busy. Well, you don't say no to Caesar. So he said, if you do it, when I'm done being mayor, and I can't do both legally, if you'll be president, then I'll take it back when I'm done. So about 10 years later, I said, Caesar, you said you'd take it back. He said, I didn't say when.
Yeah, I can tell you the one thing that Caesar shared with me was his frustration with getting the Historic Museum together. And I think Arlene and some of you others were around when that was going on. As you know, they keep shifting our city hall to the north. So it started out where Huntington Bank is today, and that shifted over to the corner of Maple and High Street. Then it finally shifted to the other side of Maple Street, or on top of Maple Street. Yeah. And then Myra Johnson, of course, she was out there yelling at all the construction workers that you're not taking my house. And so when the city eventually bought the house, she refused to sell it to them because she didn't trust the city, is basically what happened. And so she was not going to sell that house. So the city ended up purchasing the house shortly after her death, and they paid dearly for it, about double of what they had offered her earlier. But then they were going to haul it down. Some say that they were going to haul it down, just put a park there, and others say that they were hauling it down to put more parking. I think it was more parking than park. And that's what she didn't like about it. So after all this went on and she passed away and it got sold, then the city allowed it to go back to nature. So the trees grew up, they didn't mow the yard. They wanted, I think, the public to say, tear that eyesore down. Whereas a group in Wadsworth, and I wasn't involved in it, so I'm not taking any credit at all, they came together and they said, oh my gosh, you are taking down this house that means so much to the history of Wadsworth. 2 mayors lived there, 4 different doctors lived there. The owner of a carriage factory that at one time employed more than anyone in town. So you had all these different factors going on. And so it took them years to finally okay it. I don't know, Bruce, were you there during this whole controversy?
That was before.
Yeah. Yeah, when you ask council people, it's always before them. But yeah, this was back, and Caesar was in a bad way because he got elected mayor. So he said he was frustrated because he couldn't really take sides. He said he had to be a neutral party in the whole thing. But he was saying about how different ones in and around the city would razz him about that house and bring cigarette lighters in and strike him in front of his face and saying, are you ready now? And so he was really upset with that, and he would tell me about it, and that was probably the only negative thing he really talked about in his history. But the good news was, you know, and that's why he came to First Fridays. He loved the house, he loved sitting in there, and he loved talking about Myra. And he said, oh God, Roger, I was so afraid of that woman. He said, and, you know, they forced me in here, and then I think when she finally had to give him a shot in the butt, that about put him over the edge. She said, I think she intentionally stuck that in there and left it in longer than normal. Whatever. But he could be comical, but he was, you know, pretty much non-overly critical of people in a negative way. And he always kind of held his breath on things like that, which I can appreciate that he would do that. But some of the stories he did finally eke out because he just couldn't stand it anymore. And we'd laugh about it. But anyway, so I know we're got to finish up here. Again, we have some of these books for sale down at the Historical Society, which we're open on First Friday, which isn't this Friday, but a week from Friday. And also Saturday mornings, we're open 9:30 to 11:30. All the money that he gathered from these books went directly to the Historical Society, all the profits. He didn't make anything off of these. And so we're still, because we have books left over, we're still selling them and still making money off of Caesar. So that one's available. He didn't write it, but he helped with the information with Mike Berg in writing about the Wadsworth area homicides or people who died of strange circumstance under strain. So that one's also available, and they're available at the bookshelf downtown Wadsworth. We have one, I didn't bring it because we're about out of it, and how the streets got their names in Wadsworth. And that's been a popular one. In fact, we may have to do a reprint on it because we're down to like the last dozen books. But it's not like we printed 1 billion of them either. You never know how they're going to sell. The murder one jumps up at Christmas time every year, so figure that one out. Any other questions or comments about Dr. Carrino, and something you want to share back in the back. They're coming back with the microphone. Don't breathe until they get to you.
Each of us that are here today, Caesar has touched our lives in some way. But I happened to be on a road trip one time, and I was down at the Kentucky Derby grounds. And a young lady saw my name tag, and she saw that I was from Wadsworth, Ohio. And she came running up to me, and she said, "Will you do me a favor?" And I said, "Me? Sure, I'll do you a favor. What would you like me to do?" She went into the office, got a brochure, wrote something on it, and she said, "Will you take this back to Wadsworth and give it to Dr. Carrino, and please tell him one of his students has really made it." And that had such an impression on me that she thought so much of him and wanted me to convey that message. So the next morning when I took that into his office when he was mayor. But one of his students thought so much of him, she wanted me to convey the message back to him. She made it.
Yeah, ironically, the same thing happened to me, but in reverse. He kept telling me that his son Jerry bragged about me being the best teacher he ever had. Well, I never had Jerry. I volunteered at Isham School in a 4th grade classroom. You do that prior to student teaching. So I volunteered in there, and I went in a couple of times a week and put in maybe a couple hours. But every time he would bring that up, I'd say, "Remember, Caesar, I was never his teacher. I mean, I was a college student and trying to learn how to be a teacher. Well, whatever you did, you left a lasting impression." And so I think the last time he said it, I just let it go. I'm thinking, okay, yes, I had him. And of course, I saw Jerry then at the funeral home. And he looks just like a miniature Caesar. He didn't look like that in elementary school, but then again, I didn't look the same either. So that was kind of a funny story relative to Caesar. Anything else? Because we went way over time, and it's costing them big bucks to have me here today. They flew me in from Seville, so. Yes, sir. Hang on.
I was just thinking of Caesar. He had such a beautiful voice.
Yes.
And like at 4th of July, the concerts at the Central, just when he announced, just such a beautiful voice. And then I remember singing with him in the community chorus.
Yeah, his voice took over, that's for sure. And he's like his twin over here. Another voice that...
There you go, Milo.
Milo, yes. Kind of that same booming voice.
The Mexicans call me Senor Boca Grande.
Boca Grande, okay.
Mr. Big Mouth.
Okay, que bueno. So anything else for the good of the cause? And I encourage you to stop by the museum if you haven't been in there. Like I tell people, 95% of the things that are on display in there are from Wadsworth or connected to Wadsworth. Over the years, we kind of got rid of some of the other things that we used for filler, but it's an exciting thing to, especially if you grew up in Wadsworth. And you can, yeah, a transplant. You can see all the matches. You can see what actual injectors and valves look like, because we have tons of them. Box boards, we have some of the actual box boards that were made down in Rittman. And
What are the hours?
9:30 to 11:30 Saturday morning, and also on First Fridays, which is 5:30 to 8 o'clock.
Oh, somebody just asked what First Friday was. Here, Tom can explain what First Friday is.
Well, from Main Street Wadsworth, every first Friday of the month, there's an event downtown from 5:30 to 8 o'clock. There's different themes throughout the year. The one coming up in June is going to be the First Responders First Friday. College Street is shut down, and all the safety forces from Wadsworth, Medina County, Sheriff's Department, all around will be down there with their, the SWAT teams, and everybody and fire trucks, and everybody can come down and talk to the officers, the paramedics, the firemen. The kids can get in the trucks and everything else. So that's the one coming up in July. And again, the Historical Society is always open during every one of those first Fridays as well.
Right, and June is always open.
And we have root beer floats.
That's the first Friday in June.
Katie,
Did they have the Ohio match in there?
Yes, we have a lot of Ohio matches. Book matches, stick matches. And if you didn't know this, you're going to know it now. It's something to talk about over the supper table tonight. In one 24-hour period of time, the Ohio Match Company produced enough matches, if put end to end, it would go halfway around the world. Wow. In a half day. And they ran 3 shifts, 24 hours. And they didn't get closed down during the wars because everybody needed matches. So it was an essential. It was the same thing with the injector. They did not pull back on the hours of that because it was a military thing. They had to have the valves for the new ships and battleships, submarines that were being produced.
Well, let's give Roger a big round of applause.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me, and we'll see you at the museum.
And if everybody hasn't heard, next
That's
Friday,
cool.
the 7th, June 7th, if you haven't signed up yet, we are going to have a wonderful time here having a sock hop. We have Akron's only oldies band, celebration band. They are fabulous. They were here last year for our 10th anniversary. The cafe will have food specials, diner-style food specials.